Yay, it's section 10! Isn't everybody excited? Today we are talking about sentencing, okay? So you've gone through your trial, you've been found guilty, now what? Here's our funny internet picture of the section. Oh, man, Billy Connolly. He is such a funny guy. If you don't know Billy Connolly, please open another YouTube window, look up Billy Connolly, watch one of his videos, then come back to this video and finish it. So, sentencing. The history of sentencing, it begins with fines, okay? So at the time we found it, the Code of Hammurabi was the oldest legal code we knew of. We have since found older ones, but the Code of Hammurabi was this very important historical, well, we call it a document, but it was, chiseled in stone, and it was thousands of years old, and it basically listed a set of laws and their associated punishments from this ancient civilization in the Middle East. And a lot of the punishments were fines, right? So if you committed this crime, if you killed somebody else's slave, you had to pay them a fine of this much silver. If you did this to somebody's daughter, you had to pay this much silver. If you burned down a man's house, you had to pay this much, right? So fines have been a punishment since the whole concept of a legal system really began. Okay, fines are an incredibly common. I'm pretty sure every civilization on the planet, both today and throughout history, has had some kind of system where somebody who screws up or violates somebody else's rights or whatever, commits some crime, gets punished by fines. Okay. Now, there are other kinds of punishments that come into play throughout history. One of the most historically interesting is this thing called ordeals. Okay. Now, an ordeal, which was very common in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, was essentially trial and punishment all in one. Okay, and they would be slightly different each time, but essentially what an ordeal would be was we're going to put you in this life-threatening situation. If you survived, that means God was behind you, God believed you, you didn't, you were innocent, and we're gonna, that's God showing that you're innocent if you survive. If you don't survive, well, you're obviously being punished for something. God didn't want to intervene on your behalf, and now not only did we find you guilty, but, as part of the process, you're dead, right? So this could have been like throwing somebody in a river. If they survived being dunked in the water and being swept downstream, they were obviously innocent and God smiled upon them. If they drowned, well, sucks for you. That must mean you were guilty. A really interesting part of this comes in as time goes on, it switches, okay? So by the time we hit, 1600s, 1700s, they're looking for witches in different parts of Western Europe and the United States at this point. And it's switched. So now if we throw you in a river and you don't drown, that must mean you're a witch. Because there's some line in the Bible that says something about a witch is going to be lighter than a duck or something. So if you survive the drowning, you're a witch, and we're going to kill you. If you don't survive the drowning, that means you weren't a witch, but now you're dead. So, sucks for you. But ordeals were a very, very historically interesting concept. Okay, corporal punishment is one that's been very, very common throughout tons of cultures, throughout all of history. Corporal punishment just basically means some kind of physical punishment for your crimes. Okay, this was very common, especially in navies. Back when the days of sailing ships, all the way back to ancient Greece and stuff. If you were a sailor and you committed some kind of crime on the ship, whether it's thieving or assaulting another sailor or whatever, they didn't have the ability to fine you, really, because you didn't have any money because you were on a ship. They didn't have the ability to lock you up, right? Because they couldn't afford to lose a sailor. They didn't want to kill you because, again, they didn't want to lose a sailor. So they used corporal punishment. And, usually it was like a whipping. They would tie you to one of the masts. Depending on how severe the thing you did was, they would whip you a certain number of times. And then that was your punishment. It is still technically legal in many state public school systems. You should Google right now your state's public school system and is corporal punishment legal? Because there are many places in the United States to this day where if you mess up in school, the principal is allowed to, spank you on the bottom with one of the paddle thingies. So corporal punishment is still used today. Torture was often a sentence throughout human history. If you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, there's that horrible scene at the very end. Spoiler alert, where the main character gets tortured as part of a sentence for committing some crime against the country of England. So that has been a big popular one over human history. Economic servitude. This is a very interesting one. So essentially, what they say here is if you commit some crime, we're going to sentence you to be essentially a slave on somebody's farm or plantation or factory or whatever for a certain amount of time, right? So instead of keeping you in prison for 5 years, we're going to send you to this factory for 5 years, and you have to work in that factory as your sentence, right? Or we're going to send you to this farm, and you have to do what the farmer says for 5 years or whatever. That has been a big one, especially in places where they can't, small communities in very, very, very rural or outlying areas where they can't afford to lose a member of the community. They need everybody to work hard if they're going to plant and harvest enough food to survive the winter. That kind of thing. Castration, or somehow otherwise making it impossible to use. How can I put this? Making it impossible to use your manhood in the way it was biologically intended. Okay, I think that was a good euphemism. This has been a very popular one throughout history, especially for sex crimes. If you commit a rape or a sexual assault or whatever, you get found guilty, you can be castrated. Now, in 20th century America, this was also used in a program of eugenics. So eugenics, if you don't know, is kind of it's a perversion of the concept of evolution. And it basically says all the people who are the kind we don't like, right? So any people who do things we don't like, which of course includes criminals, we're going to make sure they don't have kids. Because if they have kids, their kids are going to grow up to be criminals, and that's bad, and we don't want to have to punish them. And we, to reduce the crime rate for the future generations, we're just going to take all of the criminals out of the gene pool. But then it went, it wasn't just criminals. It was those with mental illness. So we're going to take all the mental illness, all those people with mental illness and make it so they can't have kids, men and women alike. People who are, Down syndrome, we're going to make sure they can't have kids. Basically all of the undesirables, we're going to make sure they can't have kids. And this was common in the United States up until the 1970s. Like the last time there was an involuntary castration for purposes of eugenics in the United States was in the 1970s. And it's still going on around the planet today. But castration for punishment for sex crimes is still used in the United States in the 21st century. We still use it today. There are some jurisdictions where if you're convicted of a sex crime, they give you the choice between you can spend this long in prison, or we can do what's called chemical castration, where they give you some drug that, and that drug, essentially, let's just say it's the opposite of Viagra. Okay? in the 1950s, there was a guy named Alan Turing who essentially invented modern computing. He's a brilliant guy, helped win World War II. There was a movie about him called The Imitation Game, starring Benedict Cumberbatch, or whatever the dude's name is. Brilliant movie. Totally recommend seeing this movie. But after helping win World War II, in the early 50s, they caught him with a gay lover. And at the time, in Britain, it was illegal to be gay. So they gave him the choice of prison or chemical castration, and he chose chemical castration so that he could stay and work on his electronics and computers and stuff. And it was so hard on him that he ended up committing suicide. So chemical castration is not easy. It is not an easy choice. It is not a, yeah, it cost us Alan Turing. Let's leave it at that. Another common sentence or punishment throughout history has been banishment, or what's also called transportation. And that's essentially means you have to leave our group. Okay. Now, in the early days, when it's, we're talking tribal hunter-gatherer days, if you banish somebody from the group, that was essentially a death sentence because they couldn't survive on their own. Their only real choice was to go and find another group that they could live with. But you can't live with our group anymore. That's the banishment part. In more modern times, this meant that if you committed some crime, we're going to send you to a colony, right? So in England, in Britain, up until 1776, they would send a lot of their prisoners, they would sentence them to transportation and send their prisoners to the United States, the colonies, right? But then in 1776, we declared independence. We're no longer a colony. And their main target of transportation, the prisoners from Great Britain, instead of being shipped to the American colonies, because they couldn't do that anymore, they started shipping them to Australia, which is way scarier than the United States, right? The United States has a few spiders and snakes and stuff, but in Australia, everything's trying to kill you. But so that's how a lot of the Europeans made it to Australia, was via this transportation system where they committed some crime in Britain, got their punishment was being thrown on a ship, sailed down to Australia, and they had to live there. So that's been a very common one throughout history. And then finally, the most common one for felonies today in the 21st century, by far the most common for big crimes, is imprisonment. You commit some felony, you commit some violation, and you are going to be imprisoned. You're going to be locked up in a cage and for X number of years. So, insanity. Insanity is one of those things that are very misunderstood. I believe I mentioned on a previous section that there are different, the definition of insanity has changed over time. Okay? And the definitions of insanity have included, did you have the mens rea, which we talked about in an earlier section, in order to commit the crime? Did you have the mental capacity to have that mental component of committing a crime? Because if you didn't have the mental capacity to have the mens rea to commit the crime, then you were insane. Other times the definition has basically said, at the time of the crime, did you understand the difference between right and wrong? Which is very similar to the first one, but subtly different. And it's changed a few times, and but it mostly hovers around that whole, did you understand what you were doing kind of thing, right? That's the overarching theme of all the different definitions of insanity is, did you understand what you were doing? Or were you so mentally problematic with schizophrenia or whatever mental disorder you have, was that bad enough that you couldn't really know what you were doing? How often is it used? It is used about 1% of all trials, right? So it is an incredibly, incredibly rare defense. And it is an affirmative defense, which we also discussed in a previous section, right? Meaning that it's not up to the prosecution to prove that the defendant was sane. The burden of proof shifts, and now the defendant has to prove that they were insane beyond a reasonable doubt? Can they convince the jury that they were insane? And they're going to call in psychiatrists and all these things. Now, in the 1% of cases in which the insanity defense is used, how often is it successful? Well, single digits. It is very rarely successful. It is incredibly difficult to convince a jury that you were insane at the time of a crime. Very, very, very difficult. But so, 5% of 1% is this teeny tiny fraction of all the felony trials that are held in the United States. But people get really upset at insanity. It's like, how dare he get off on a technicality and blah, blah, blah. And it is very, very, very difficult to prove insanity. And then if you are found insane, you don't get to go home. They don't release you. They send you to essentially a psychiatric prison. Most states, they have some kind of like state hospital, and you get sent there, which is very similar to a prison, only it's mental illness focused instead of, punishment focused. And the vast majority, and you stay in that mental institution until the doctors say you are cured. And in the vast majority of cases, that's the rest of their life. So if you are found not guilty by reason of insanity, this turns into essentially, most of the time, a life sentence in a mental institution. So you don't get to go home. You don't get off the vast majority of the time. You're still punished. So when we talk about sentencing, the focus is on what's fair, what's just, right? I mean, this is the criminal justice system. So what is justice in this case? We've found this person guilty of committing X number of crimes. How do we make sure that that's fair? How do we make sure that the sentence they face is actually justice? Excuse me. So, the enemy of fairness, the enemy of justice is bias, right? And where can the bias creep in? Well, there's lots of different places for this bias to creep in. And we can tell quantifiably that there is things like racial bias creeping in somewhere. The question is, where is it? Where is the racial bias? Is it on the part of the police? Is it on the part of the prosecutor? Is it on the part of the judge? Is it a little bit of everything, right? There's a little bit of racial bias at each stage, and then so by the end, we see this huge racial impact. But it could be anything from the law to the judge and what the judge decides based on who the defendant is. The prosecutor, because they have a huge amount of leeway on what to charge and how much to charge and all these things. The defense attorney, the jury, and then the pre-sentence investigator, right? So after you're found guilty, there is some amount of time between being found guilty and being sentenced. And in that time, this pre-sentence investigator comes in, researches you and your life and all these things, and gives the judge a kind of document that talks all about you. And then the judge uses that to decide your sentence. So that's another source of possible bias in the system. And any kind of bias, whether it's racial or gender or income or whatever, can leak in at any one of those stages. And it's difficult to tell where it's coming in a lot of times. We can tell that prior to arrest and after the sentence is complete, somewhere within that giant range, there is racial bias. But it's really, really, really difficult to tell where that bias comes in based on all of these different things up here. Okay. All right. So, last slide for section 9.1. Is this 9.1 or 8, 9, 10? I don't know. Whatever section we're on. There are different ways that you can do sentencing, Okay. In some times, you'll watch in the movies or TV, or you'll read in the news or whatever, that a person was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Okay. But then other times you'll hear that the judge sentenced them to 5 to 10 years in prison, and it's a range. Okay. That is the difference between determinate and indeterminate sentencing. If the judge says you're sentenced to 5 years in prison, that is determinate. They're giving one number. That is your sentence. Now, does that mean that's actually how long you're going to serve? No. You can get out early based on good behavior. There's parole. There's all kinds of things. You will probably be out long before your 5 years is up. But that is your sentence. When the judge sentences you to 5 to 10 years, that means that you could be out in as soon as 5 with parole and all the good behavior and all that stuff. Or if you don't get those things, you're going to have to serve the entire 10 years. So in both those situations, there is a range of what sentence you're actually going to serve. With determinate sentencing, they just give you the max. With indeterminate sentencing, they tell you what the minimum and maximum is, and then it kind of makes it a little more explicit that the amount of time you actually serve in prison is variable. Okay? Now, in a lot of cases, there's what's called mandatory sentencing, meaning the judge can't give you anything but this sentence. This has become kind of a big area of controversy with federal drug laws. Okay? So federal judges, because of laws that have been passed by the federal government, if somebody is convicted of the federal crime of drug trafficking or drug possession or drug use, whatever, these federal drug crimes, there are these mandatory sentences that they have to have. So if you get convicted of, importing cocaine into the United States, you have to serve pulling numbers out of thin air here. I don't know if this is the exact number, but you have to serve, say, 15 years or 20 years or whatever. And the judge cannot give you less than that mandatory sentence. And a lot of people are very upset at this because it results in people who have done something bad, should probably serve some time in prison. It results in them serving really ridiculous sentences for what are comparatively very minor crimes. Many states are going with what are called habitual offender laws. The famous one of these is California's 3 strikes law. Hopefully we've all heard of this. It's been all over the media, the news, and movies and TV and stuff, where if you commit 3 felonies, the sentence for your 3rd felony has to be life in prison. Like, the judge can't give you anything less than life in prison for that 3rd felony. Other states have similar laws on the books, where if you commit X number of felonies, you have to go to prison for 20 years, or you have to go to prison for life, or whatever. And they're all slightly different based on the state, based on exactly how those laws are written. But they all have that kind of thing in common, where if you can commit this number of felonies, you're going away to prison for a long, long time. And sometimes those felonies, I think in California, the 3 strikes law, those 3 strikes have to be on 3 different incidents. But in other states, if you commit one incident where 3 different felonies were committed, so, a kidnapping, a rape, and a robbery all in the same, or kidnapping, rape, and murder, or kidnapping, rape, and robbery, or whatever, if, those 3 different felonies can all be in the same one incident, and that triggers the habitual offender law. Other times it has to be different incidents, right? And those are resulting in really overcrowded prisons, right? So a lot of times the 3rd strike will be something relatively minor. It'll be a very minor, non-violent felony, but then they have to be sentenced to life in prison, which is a very controversial thing, right? Recently, there have been a lot of these truth in sentencing laws that have been passed, because a lot of victims especially were getting upset that the person who victimized them was getting sentenced to 20 years in prison. And they're like, oh, great, 20 years. I can be, confident and safe that this person is going to be away in prison for 20 years. And, man, all right, that's justice. But then they're out in 7 years. And the person's like, wait a minute, 7? Wait, I thought they were going to be away for 20. So these truth in sentencing laws require courts and corrections officials to kind of be honest about when they're going to be available for parole, how much good time they're available to get, all these things, so that especially victims, but also other people in the community, can know that even though they're sentenced to 20 years, they could theoretically be out in 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever. Okay? All right. That is the end of section, whatever subsection we're talking about. We'll be back and talk about some reasons for punishment next.